There are moments in life that if we hadn't witnessed them with our own eyes, we would have a hard time believing they could happen. Right in the middle of America, in a first-class airplane cabin in broad daylight in front of dozens of adults, who were silently looking on as if silence could make them innocent. A 1-2-year-old black boy, neatly dressed, sat neatly in seat 1C, and within seconds he was forced to stand up to leave the seat he had paid for. No explanation, no look at his ticket, no chance to defend himself. What if that were your child? What would you do when your child is treated as if he or she is out of place in the very country you believe in? Justice, and if one day you are forced to make a choice, stay silent and let things pass by, or stand up to change something bigger than yourself. The story is not noisy, not sensational, but it will touch the deepest place in your heart. Stay until the end. And before we begin, if you value stories of dignity and truth, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to share what needs to be said. That afternoon, Denver International Airport was ablaze with the golden light of late afternoon streaming through miles of glass. People were hurrying, but not frantic. Every step had a purpose to return, to begin to escape, or to seek something new. In the crowd, there was a boy pulling a small navy blue suitcase. He held the suitcase tightly as if he was afraid it would be lost in the crowd. His name was Evan Hale, 12 years old, with a slim figure and gentle, sharp eyes, the kind of eyes of a child who has learned to observe the world before the world has begun to observe him. Evan was not a child who wanted to attract attention. He grew up in a quiet family. His father, Marcus Hale, is the CEO of Hale Tech Solutions, one of the technology corporations that advises on strategy for major airlines in the United States, especially programs to combat unconscious bias. People know him as a black man full of intelligence, calm, and very unshakable under pressure. Evan's mother once joked, "You're just like your father. You don't talk much, but when you do, people stop and think." That's true when Evan is calm, and even more true when he's faced with injustices he never sought out. Evan's flight today takes him to Portland. He's attending a Youth Science Awards ceremony where he placed in the top 10 nationally. Even at 12, he has a collection of his own robot models, small, sophisticated, and controlled by a simple algorithm he designed himself. But what makes his parents most proud is not the award, but the way he sees the world. Patient, empathetic, always trying to stand straight, even when it sometimes feels like the wind is blowing in the opposite direction. Evan has flown solo many times. Each time his parents have prepared carefully ticket confirmation. Call unaccompanied minors support. Note all necessary procedures according to U.S. aviation standards. Same this time. Everything was perfect. Or at least they thought so. The boys stepped into the first-class cabin of North Star Airlines Flight 806. The wide, light gray leather seats reflected the sunlight through the windows. Evan sat down in seat 1C, placed his backpack at his feet, and kept his back straight as his father had taught him. He breathed a sigh of relief. It felt safe. But seconds later, the click of high heels on the carpet echoed in his chest. A blonde woman in her 40s wearing a dark blue uniform walked up. Her name tag read Christine Ward, lead flight attendant. Christine's eyes were not those of someone willing to help. It was like an invisible scale was assessing whether the boy in front of her belonged here or not. "Sweetie," Christine said, her voice soft but firm. "You'll need to move. This seat isn't yours." Evan looked up, not arguing, not panicking. "Ma'am, here's my ticket. 1C. Christine smiled the smile adults used when they thought they were absolutely right. "Seat 1C is for elite travelers, and we don't place unaccompanied minors here. Please stand up. I'll take you to your correct seat." Evan handed the ticket with both hands, a gesture he'd learned from his mother, respectful and polite. Christine glanced at it, not really reading it, then shook her head. The first-class cabin fell strangely silent. The adults watched but said nothing. A few looked annoyed on the boy's behalf, but silence was easier than talking. Evan felt everyone's eyes on him, not because he was wrong, but because people were looking at him like he was a kid who had ended up somewhere he didn't belong. In that moment, Evan remembered what his father often repeated: "Strength doesn't require volume. Stand firm, son." And so he sat, gently, without defiance, without trembling. "Ma'am, I think there's a misunderstanding," Christine interrupted. "No misunderstanding. Stand up." Her voice was as sharp as a knife, cutting into the boy's young but resilient pride. In premium economy, a silver-haired man, Richard Cole, frowned slightly. He knew something was wrong, but he hesitated. It's not my problem. His thoughts were the same as hundreds of others, and that was the problem. Evan swallowed, his eyes dropping to the floor, not out of shame, but because he was struggling with the choice between going along and letting it go, or keeping his place as his father had taught him. He wanted to stand up for what was right, but he was only 12 years old, and faced with an adult who was forcing himself on him. Finally, Evan took a deep breath, a long, slow breath that felt as heavy as the sky pressing down on his chest. He stood up. That is the moment when many people who hear this story will feel a pang in their hearts. Not because Evan is wrong, but because we all had a childhood where adults held power in their hands, and we were forced to walk away even though we knew it was unfair. Christine led Evan through first class. Each step was a reminder, you are not worthy. Evan walked slowly, eyes not looking at anyone but clearly seeing every gaze, speaking for them confusion, concern, or indifference. As she walked past row 4, Christine said softly but loud enough for Evan to hear, "You'll thank me later, sweetie. This is for the best." Evan felt clearly none of this was best. He was placed in the back row next to the emergency exit, a seat where children were not allowed according to FAA regulations. But Christine didn't care. She just wanted him out of her sight. Evan put down his backpack. He sat up straight. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. But inside him there was a void opening up, so empty that he could hear his own heartbeat. And in that moment of stunned silence, he knew what he had to do. He took out his phone. He pressed a single name. Dad, it's happening again. The morning before his flight, Evan Hale woke up as the sun was just touching the rooftops of his quiet neighborhood in Aurora, Colorado. The sunlight always felt good. Not too harsh, not too fast, creeping into the room slowly, as if testing his readiness for the day. Evan got out of bed and straightened the sheets. His mother, Angela Hale, had always taught him, a good day begins with the little things in order. He believed that, and he also believed that neatness was not only in the bed, but also in his thoughts, in the way he faced the world, especially a world that sometimes was not as gentle as the morning light. He changed into a white dress shirt, buttoning each button slowly. Then he pulled on the gray sweater his father, Marcus Hale, had bought him last year. Marcus wasn't one to give expensive gifts, but each one was meaningful. The sweater was a gift from Evan after he'd completed his first mini-robot project. He remembered Marcus saying clearly, "You can build anything, Evan, but the most important thing is that you build yourself." Evan always carried that saying with him, and this morning it echoed in his mind, softly but enough to steady his heart. Downstairs, the delicious smell of pancakes wafted through the kitchen. Angela stood by the stove, occasionally glancing out the window as if to make sure the weather was going to be kind to her son. When Evan came down, she smiled, but there was a worry in her eyes that only mothers can hide so poorly. "Did you sleep well?" Evan nodded. "Yes. I'm ready." Angela knew her son well enough to know that when he said ready, he didn't just mean ready for the trip, he meant ready for anything. The mother and son sat down to breakfast. Evan ate slowly, not in a hurry. He wasn't the type of child who was so excited that he forgot to chew. He was the type of teenager whose emotions were as calm as a lake, but underneath there was a strong and unpredictable current. Before heading to the airport, Evan stopped by his father's office. Marcus was reviewing a presentation for an important conference. His suit was hanging on a chair, his computer was on, and his watch was neatly placed beside him. Evan knocked softly on the door. Marcus looked up, his dark brown eyes, lighting up immediately, as if the work at hand was never more important than seeing his son. "Son," he said, his smile brief but warm. "Come to say hello." Evan walked in, said nothing, just went up and hugged his father. It was a short, sweet hug, but it felt right, like two puzzle pieces falling into place. Marcus held his son's shoulder and asked, "How do you feel about the trip?" "I'm fine." "Just a little nervous," Evan said honestly. He didn't like lying, especially to his father. Marcus looked at Evan for a second, then nodded. "Worrying doesn't make you weak. It just reminds you that you're facing something important." Then he put his hand to his chest. "But here you have everything to overcome." Evan inhaled, letting out a small smile. "Yeah, I remember." Before leaving the room, Evan heard his father call out, "Evan, whatever happens, choose to stay calm. A cool head and a warm heart will take you further than anything." He turned back and nodded again. That sentence followed him all the way to the airport. The family's black SUV pulled up in front of the departures gate at Denver International Airport. The bustle, the announcements, the rattling of suitcases, all of it combined into the typical sounds of departures. Evan pulled his small suitcase. Angela walked beside him, keeping a pace that was just right so as not to overwhelm him but also not to make him feel alone. When I arrived at the check-in counter, the North Star Airlines staff member smiled professionally. "Are you traveling alone? Let me help you." Evan handed over his passport ticket and even his child's permit to travel alone. Everything was going smoothly. There was no indication that in a few dozen minutes he would be facing one of the most unforgettable memories of his life. The staff member finished checking and smiled, complimenting, "You are very confident. Not everyone can be so calm when traveling alone for the first time." Evan bowed his head in thanks. Angela looked at the scene, her eyes filled with pride and worry. As they approached gate 32, Evan stopped and turned to his mother. "I'll be fine, Mom." Angela stroked Evan's hair. "I know, but whatever you do, call us when you need us. You don't always have to be strong alone." Evan did not reply to that. He just hugged his mother gently, as independent children often do, to reassure their parents, not the other way around. The moment Evan stepped through the boarding gate, everything was completely normal. A young flight attendant smiled and said, "Welcome to North Star Flight 806. Evan stepped into the first-class cabin. The soft yellow lighting, the wide seats, the smell of new leather, the aroma of coffee from the galley, everything made him feel safe. He found the right seat, number 1C. He sat down, put his backpack at his feet, and fastened his seatbelt. He calmed his mind. But Evan didn't know. In just a few minutes, that composure would be tested in a way a 1-2-year-old should never have to experience. A challenge that sometimes even adults struggle with. As passengers continued to board, Evan looked out the window. Ground vehicles moved smoothly. Lights flashed. Sunlight glowed on the plane like a blessing. Evan thought about the awards ceremony in Portland. About the speech he had been preparing for weeks. About his father's words. "You don't have to raise your voice. Just stand up straight." Little did he know he would have to use that lesson sooner than he thought. And the moment began with the sound of high heels clicking on the carpet right in front of him. In the first-class cabin of North Star Airlines Flight 806, the first few minutes are always very special. A luxurious yet peaceful space where people prepare for a comfortable flight laptop, opened book placed next to it, cold glass of water waiting. Evan sat there in his own little silence, thinking the world would leave him alone. But then Christine Ward's footsteps echoed. Each step even heavy and deliberate. He heard the sound before he saw her. A sound that made the space seem to shrink. Christine stopped right in front of seat 1C, her cold blue eyes glancing from Evan's combed hair to the white shirt he wore. The look didn't need words, but Evan knew. She had made up her mind about him the moment she saw him. "Sweetie," Christine said, her voice soft but not gentle. "You need to stand. This chair is not for you." Evan turned back, still as calm as his father had taught him. "Here is my ticket, ma'am. Seat 1C. He handed her the ticket. Christine didn't touch it, look at it, or even glance at it. She just shook her head. "Unaccompanied minors aren't seated in first class. Please stand up. Now." When he heard the word "now," Evan felt his heart sink. Not because he was afraid, but because he recognized the situation. In painfully familiar. A memory flashed through his mind. Another time, another company, another adult had forced him out of his rightful place. Evan took a deep breath. He looked down at the ticket again. He knew he was right. But sometimes in this world, being right doesn't help. He looked up slowly. "I think there's a mistake. The Child Support Department has confirmed it, ma'am." Christine smiled. It was half smirk, half contempt. "Sweetie, listen to your elders. You don't belong in this chair." The word "belong" made Evan's shoulders sag a little. Not because he was weak, but because he understood perfectly well what she meant. Around people began to observe. Mr. Richard Cole, the older man at Premium, leaned in slightly to get a better look. He saw the boy polite, neatly dressed, sitting in the correct seat number. And he saw the head steward, chasing him away like someone who had mistakenly wandered into the VIP room. Richard pursed his lips. He didn't like to interfere, but the sight made him uncomfortable. In row 1D, a young woman glanced at Christine, then at Evan. Her eyes were filled with confusion, but she said nothing. That's the sad thing about adults. So many of them know they're wrong but choose to stay silent to avoid trouble. Evan felt them all. Every glance, every breath, every second of silence that no one wanted to break. But that silence became a mirror, reflecting the loneliness of a child placed in a position he did not deserve. Christine crossed her arms, her voice sharper. "Will you stand up? We don't want to cause trouble before we take off." Inside Evan, a small struggle raged. On one side was his father's words, "Stand firm." On the other side was reality. He was just a kid in a plane full of adults. Evan looked at the ticket, then at the vast first-class seats in front of him, then at Christine, who was standing too close, too imposing, too powerful for a child. He swallowed, placed his hands on the arms of the chair, and stood up, not because you're wrong, but because you know. Sometimes calmness must come before the truth is heard. Christine put her hand on his shoulder, gentle but authoritative. "Good boy, follow me." The two words, "good boy," were like a cold knife cutting into Evan's young but resilient self-esteem. Evan walked down the aisle of first class, each step heavier than the last. The spacious space suddenly felt cramped. The plush leather seats seemed to be witness to some kind of ritual gone wrong. Some looked at him with pity. Some looked away, not wanting to face the truth. Some looked annoyed, as if he was disturbing their experience. Evan understood that silence hurt more than the insult, because silence is complicity, and complicity is how injustice has persisted for so long. Christine led him through premium economy, through the rows of windows, through the rustling of newspapers and the sounds of adults pretending not to hear, not to see. Finally, she stopped in the last row, next to the emergency exit where children were not allowed to sit under FAA rules. But Christine didn't care. "Sit here. This is better for everyone. Better for everyone." Evan felt his chest tighten. He put down his backpack. He sat up straight. His hands rested lightly on his thighs as if to steady himself. His eyes stared into the void ahead, a long, narrow void filled with the sigh of injustice. Richard Cole closed his eyes. He felt a heavy sense of loss, not because the boy had been displaced, but because he, a 6-7-year-old man, had been silent like thousands of other adults. Maria Lopez in the next row whispered to herself, "Why didn't I say something?" But the whisper only echoed in her heart. No one heard it. Christine turned and walked away as if everything was over. But for Evan, it's just the beginning. He looked down at his hands. They weren't shaking, but his heart was. He picked up the phone. No more searching, no hesitation. Just click a name. When the voice on the other side rang out, Evan closed his eyes slightly. "Dad, it's happening again." When Evan dialed his dad's number, he wasn't expecting a grand rescue or an angry outburst. All he wanted was one thing, an adult who would listen, not judge. 20 miles away in the Hale Tech offices in downtown Denver, Marcus Hale stood at his clipboard. He had just finished a meeting on passenger equity, a project he had spent years working on with airlines, including North Star Airlines. The phone on the table vibrated. The screen displayed a familiar line, "Evan, my son." Marcus never missed a call from his son. Not once. He picked up. "Evan, are you at the gate yet?" On the other end, Evan was silent for an unnaturally long second. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Dad." Evan's voice was small but calm, the kind of calm Marcus had learned to recognize. It wasn't peaceful but compressed. "It's happening again." Marcus's hand tightened on the phone. He turned away from the window and took a deep breath, as if the air in the room had changed. "Where are you?" Marcus asked, his voice low and calm but with an underlying force, the force of a man who had experienced the very thing his son was going through. "Evan Dopp, they moved me, Dad. I showed the ticket, but the flight attendant said I don't belong there." Not a sound other than his son's voice echoed in the quiet office. No typing, no air conditioning. It seemed as if the world had stopped so Marcus could hear every word. Marcus leaned his arms on the table, and for just the briefest of moments his eyes closed, as if an old memory had been stirred up. Years ago, when Marcus was a young engineer, he was asked to leave the VIP lounge despite having a platinum card. The staff member said the same thing Evan had heard. "Sir, you must be confused. This area isn't for you." Without anyone saying it, he understood the implication behind it. Marcus got through it. He built companies, became CEO, wrote books, and stood on big stages. But that scar, and the one he vowed his son would never have to endure, remained deep in his heart. And yet now, it happened. Not to him, but to Evan. The 1-2-year-old he taught every single thing about calm, about dignity, about standing firm. Evan waited silently. Marcus heard his breathing, even but heavy. "Did anyone yell at you?" Marcus asked. "No. But She didn't look at the ticket. She just told me to stand up. Marcus knew immediately what that meant. He didn't need to say it. Where are you sitting now? Last row. Near the emergency exit. A pause. Dad, kids aren't allowed in here. Right. Marcus closed his eyes. Yes. Evan swallowed. I know. In that moment, Marcus Hale was no longer the CEO of Hale Tech, no longer the airline consultant, no longer the calm man at the conference. He is just a father. A father heard his son's voice and realized this pain is all too familiar. And it is never worth any child's life. Marcus stood up straight and reached for his blazer. Good Evan, you did the right thing by calling me. I don't want to bother you. Marcus paused. He placed his hand on his chest as if to keep his emotions from rising too quickly. Evan, you never bother me. When something unfair happens to you, I want to be the first to know. Do you understand? Yes, Dad. Good. Now listen to me. No arguing, no fighting. Just sit still. I'm coming. Evan was silent again for a moment. Then his voice was very small, but it was like a knife, piercing straight into Marcus's heart. Dad, I tried to stay calm. But why does this keep happening? Marcus took a deep breath. Someday the world will be different, but until then, I will stand with you every step of the way. Evan did not answer immediately. Then he said, Yes, I'll wait for you, Dad. Marcus hung up, and in that moment, his face turned cold as steel, not uncontrolled anger, but the determination of a man who has been through everything his child is going through and vows it will stop here. He walked out of the office. The glass door closed behind him, reflecting off his father as he prepared to face a system he had helped build and now would hold accountable. On the way to the elevator, his assistant Nora Bennett ran after him. Mr. Hale, where are you going? We have a meeting with the board at 4 o'clock. Marcus said only one sentence. My son needs me. Nora froze in place. No one dared to ask further. Stepping into the parking lot, Marcus pushed the button to start his gray sedan. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't make any phone calls. He didn't talk. He just drove. Concentrated. Every muscle in his face tensed, just enough to keep his wits about him. But his eyes, the eyes that were always calm on stage, had something else burning in them now. A fire that was low but strong like a furnace forging steel. In Marcus's mind, 3 voices rang out. Not again. Not my son. Not today. At the Denver airport, Evan sat still, not moving, not crying. He just looked at his hands on his thighs and tried to keep them steady. Steady as his father had taught him. Passengers walked by. No one noticed the boy sitting in the wrong seat according to safety regulations. No one asked why. No one asked. Why is a first-class child sitting at the back of the plane? Christine was busy adjusting the linens in first class as if the incident had never happened. A silence fell. A silence that made it clear to Evan this was more than just a chair. This is where people decide who you are before you even open your mouth to say anything. Evan closed his eyes for a second. In the darkness behind his lashes, he saw his father. Saw the words, just stand up straight, and you wait. No panic, no rush, just wait. Because Evan knew, when his father said Dad is coming, it wasn't just a promise, it was a declaration. One statement will change this entire cabin. Maybe even the airline. And maybe something bigger than that. Inside the cabin of North Star Airlines, Flight 806, no one knew that just a few feet away, Marcus Hale was hurtling toward the airport faster than any bus on Colorado Boulevard. No one in the cabin knew that a father was about to face the confrontation he had spent his entire life avoiding for his son. But inside the cabin, another confrontation was also taking place. Silently, right in the eyes of the passengers who had witnessed Evan being removed from seat 1C. Christine Ward stood in first class, adjusting her napkin and arranging 2 glasses of water on the tray perfectly, as if everything about this morning was normal. But in the eyes of some passengers, there was an unexplained confusion. In row 1, a Richard Cole leaned back in his seat, unable to focus on the travel magazine in his hand. He wasn't used to meddling in other people's affairs, but his silence, while watching a child being mistreated, it made him feel uncomfortable with himself. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. It was a small action, but it reflected a growing wave in his mind. In the opposite row, Maria Lopez, a woman with small shoulders but strong eyes, was no longer sitting still. She looked around as if to see if anyone else had seen what she had seen. And what they saw most clearly was the naked injustice that Christine was trying to hide under the so-called regulations. Christine went to the middle cabin to report to Jonathan Reeves, the new flight attendant who was checking the passenger cabin. Jonathan was many years younger than Christine. He had softer eyes, a softer voice, and a heart more sensitive to how others were treated. This was sometimes perceived by Christine as inexperienced. "Is first class okay?" Jonathan asked, not looking up from the passenger list. "It's okay," Christine said firmly. "I put the wrong boy in the back of the plane." Jonathan paused. Just for a second. A small but distinct moment. He looked up. "What boy? There are no first-class children on this flight." Christine waved her hand. "A black boy. 1C. Can't be the right seat, I put him down." Jonathan blinked. "You mean, it can't be the right seat? Just because the boy is—" Christine interrupted Jonathan. "Don't start. Minors don't fly first class. That's the same with any airline." "No," Jonathan said slowly, "not all airlines do. And North Star does. With the guardian's consent." Christine stiffened for a second but tried to look firm. "I have made up my mind, and I don't want to argue anymore." Jonathan looked at Christine for a long moment. A heavy silence. Not because he was afraid to continue, but because he had just realized this action was not only wrong, it was dangerous. Because he knew FAA safety regulations, no children allowed in exit rows, no matter what. He put down his pen. "You put the boy near the exit. There's space in the back." "Don't worry," Christine said. Jonathan took a small step back. But that step back was a sign of something bigger to come. Meanwhile, in the back row, Evan sat as still as a statue. No one came to ask if he needed anything. No one questioned why a child was sitting in a seat that was against safety regulations. There was silence. A silence Evan was used to. A silence whose meaning he understood. Evan looked out the small window. From here he could see the wings better than ever. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, beautiful and strong, like what the world expected of those who stood up for themselves. He tried to breathe evenly. His breathing was heavy but steady. He remembered his father's words. "You don't have to be loud to be strong. You just have to not let others make you small." And even though he was sitting in the back row, the worst seat, Evan sat up straight, head raised just enough, but deep inside, he felt cold. When people didn't need to touch him to hurt him. In the middle cabin, Jonathan decided he couldn't let this go. He headed straight to the back of the plane. "Your name is Evan?" he asked softly. Evan looked up, his eyes, still determined. "Yes." Jonathan bent down to the boy's eye level. "May I see your ticket?" Evan held it out. Jonathan examined it closely. Then he straightened, looking down the aisle, his eyes changing dramatically. "You're sitting right," he said, his voice low but firm. Evan just nodded. Not because he wasn't happy to hear that, but because he didn't want to appear relieved when he wasn't safe yet. Jonathan swallowed a sigh. A 12-year-old knew how to hold back emotions like that. "Do you need water?" Jonathan asked. Evan replied immediately, "It's okay." That answer made Jonathan feel heavy-hearted. Children should not say "it's okay" the way adults should say "it's okay." Jonathan turned away. His eyes fell on the first-class cabin, where Christine stood with the proud air of someone who thought she had done the right thing. Jonathan knew. His silence now made him part of the problem. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale's car was just pulling into the airport driveway. His eyes were fixed on the target. The traffic lights changed, but in his mind there was only one image. Evan sitting alone in a row where he shouldn't be. "You are not alone," Evan Marcus told himself. "You never are." He had been through this very thing, and he was not going to let his son go through it alone. Back in first class, Maria Lopez finally couldn't take it anymore. She stood up and walked over to Christine. "Excuse me, Maria," said her voice calm but firm. "That boy just now, the black boy, I saw his ticket. He had the right seat." Christine curled her lips. "Ma'am, I've already taken care of it." "But you handled it wrong," Maria said bluntly. A man in 1D whispered, "She's right." This time, no one objected. Christine backed away slightly. Not much, but enough for the perceptive to notice that she was starting to feel confused. Back in the back row, Evan looked at his watch. 12 minutes had passed since he called his father. 12 minutes is nothing to an adult, but to him, it was long enough for the pain to penetrate deeper. Evan let out a small breath, not a sigh, just a calm that was beginning to crack. He looked outside, and had no idea that in just a few minutes, A man will enter the plane carrying a silence more terrifying than any anger. The silence of justice is approaching. The automatic glass doors at entrance B32 opened as Marcus Hale strode into the boarding area. No one had to look closely to know he was no ordinary passenger. Marcus had the air that men who have led large corporations carry: a steely calm, a straight posture, eyes that miss nothing. The boarding clerk, Kyle Henderson, a newbie, froze when he saw Marcus walk straight up without stopping to scan his card. Kyle opened his mouth. "Sir, I need to check your." Marcus gently but firmly presented the special access card that North Star Airlines issues to premium partners who have access to the cabin in case of a passenger-related emergency. Kyle glanced at the card, and immediately, his face changed. Marcus Hale, Strategic Equity Consultant, North Star Airlines Partners Division. Kyle stood up straight. "Sir, what is it?" "My son was on this flight," Marcus said, his voice as low as a well-sharpened knife. "And something happened." The clerk swallowed. "Yes, sir. I'll be right there." The boarding gate beeped and opened. Marcus didn't wait another second. He stepped into the jet bridge, a long tube of cold white light, and each step seemed to change the atmosphere, not with loud anger, but with a thick silence, like when a storm is brewing, but the clouds have yet to part. Inside the first-class cabin, Christine Ward had just finished the safety briefing when she heard the door open behind her. She turned, wearing the familiar smile of a chief flight attendant with 20 years of experience. But when she saw Marcus walk in, that smile disappeared. Not because she recognized him, she didn't know who he was, but because the energy he carried was like a mirror that reflected every mistake she had made. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush towards Christine. He just walked straight, each step light but weighty, to the first-class row. The whole cabin immediately fell silent. In 1A, Richard Cole sat up straight. In 1D, Maria Lopez placed her hand on her chest and inhaled slowly. They didn't know who he was, but they knew this was no ordinary man. Jonathan Reeves, a young flight attendant, standing near the middle cabin, saw Marcus from a distance and immediately understood this was the boy's father. Jonathan stepped forward naturally, as if led by responsibility. "Sir," he said softly, "are you looking for—" Marcus looked him straight in the eye. "Where is my son?" Jonathan sighed. "The back of the plane, sir. The emergency exit row." And just then, Maria Lopez stood up. "That's right," she said, her voice low but firm. "That boy was taken away right in front of us, without any valid reason. He had a valid ticket. He did nothing wrong," Richard Cole continued. "The boy was very polite. We saw his ticket clearly." Marcus turned to both of them, bowing his head in thanks, a simple gesture but filled with genuine gratitude. Then he looked at Jonathan. His voice was not loud, but clear. "Please take me down there." As Marcus walked the length of the plane, passengers who had never known him could sense that something important was afoot. Some quickly took out their headphones but didn't put them on. Others sat up straight, peering across the empty seats as if to observe. Unconsciously, they create a path without anyone asking. Marcus walked through the rows, every step heavier, every breath deeper, and every second closer to the moment he feared most. When he reached the last row, Evan was sitting there, small but upright, the light from the window reflecting off his face, making him look like he was trying to keep part of the world from collapsing. Marcus stopped. His world, the one he had built with effort, intelligence, honor, in that moment, shrank to the exact size of the tiny seat where Evan was sitting. "Evan," Marcus called softly. He looked up, and in his eyes, still calm, still steady, there was a crack that only fathers like Marcus could see. "Dad." Just one word. But in that one word there was relief, pain, and all the effort he had spent the past 20 minutes. Marcus knelt down next to his son, not caring that the passengers were watching, not caring that the crew was confused. He put his hand on Evan's shoulder, warm, firm, and protective. "Did I do something wrong?" Marcus asked. Evan shook his head. "No, I just sat in my seat." Marcus nodded slightly. "Okay, then leave the rest to me." After making sure Evan didn't panic, Marcus stood up. He turned back to face the entire compartment, and finally his eyes stopped on Christine Ward. Christine, who had just walked over when she heard someone kneeling beside the passenger, opened her mouth. "Sir, you are not allowed." Marcus held out his hand, light but strong enough to block further words. "You don't have to explain," Marcus said, his voice like a lake before a storm. "We'll talk, but we'll talk in front of everyone." The whole cabin slowly fell silent. The silence of man before a moment that everyone knew would be important. Christine clenched the list in her hand. "Sir, I follow the rules." "No," Marcus said immediately, not raising his voice, but clear and sharp as a knife cutting silk. "You used your own judgment. You saw a black child sitting in first class, and you decided that couldn't be right." A few passengers nodded. Others turned to each other. Christine tried to keep her voice firm. "You can't jump to conclusions like that. You didn't see his ticket," Marcus continued. "There are more than 10 people here who saw it. Don't deny it." Christine choked. Marcus took a very small breath, and in a voice so deep that it made many people shiver, he said, "You know what hurts me the most? It's not that you're wrong. It's not that you're unprofessional. It's that a 1-2-year-old had to calm herself down so she wouldn't cry, because you treated her like she didn't belong." Christine swallowed. The retort faded. Marcus took a step further. "I am Evan Hale's father. I was instrumental in creating the equal travel policy for North Star Airlines, and today my son was treated in the same way I spent my career trying to fix." The whole cabin held its breath, not because he's big, but because it's so real. Jonathan Reeves lowered his eyes. Maria Lopez put a hand to her chest. Richard Cole let out a small breath, relieved that someone had finally said what they had seen. Evan watched his father, not as a child watching a father protect him, but as a student watching a teacher teach the most important lesson of all: dignity. Marcus glanced at Jonathan. "You were the only one who checked my son's ticket. Thank you." Jonathan just bowed his head. "Sir, I was only doing the right thing." Marcus replied, "The world would be a better place if more people did the right thing like you." In that moment, in the middle of the plane before takeoff, everyone understood something bigger than seats was happening, something that they would most likely remember for the rest of their lives. The moment Marcus Hale stood across from Christine Ward, an unusual silence fell across the cabin. Not the awkward silence nor the emotionless silence of earlier, but the silence of people who knew they were witnessing something important. Christine took a step back. Jonathan stood beside her, tense but trying to keep his composure. Evan sat behind her, his back straight, as if he were holding the world up. Marcus looked at Christine a long time before speaking. His voice was deep and clear, and did not need to be raised to be heard. "Miss," Ward Marcus began, "I don't want to yell, I don't want to offend anyone, and I don't want to turn this into a drama. But I want you to understand the way you treated my son, a 1-2-year-old, is something I cannot remain silent about." Christine pursed her lips. "Sir, I'm just following the rules. Don't say, 'per regulations,'" Marcus interrupted, but his tone remained the same. "Regulations are there to protect passengers, not to justify irresponsible decisions." Maria Lopez whispered from row 1D, "That's right." Richard Cole nodded vigorously for the first time, not caring who was looking at him. Jonathan Reeves bowed his head as if in complete agreement. Christine opened her mouth. "I didn't mean Marcus," emphasized each word. "You don't need to have intention to cause harm. What you did was an act based on personal judgment, not on process. And this has real consequences, not on paper, but in a child's heart." Christine was embarrassed, as if someone were pointing out for the first time what she had always tried to deny. Marcus turned to Jonathan. "Can you confirm? Does my son have a valid ticket?" Jonathan nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, sir. Valid first-class ticket. No reason to move the boy to the back of the plane." The cabin began to murmur. The murmurs quickly turned to frustration. "A middle-aged man said I saw the boy from the beginning. He was polite and orderly. There was no reason to move." Another woman added, "She didn't even look at his ticket." Christine blushed. "Okay, everyone, but this time no one let her finish her sentence." Marcus raised his hand to signal everyone to calm down. Then he spoke slowly. "I will make my request." The air seemed to freeze. Christine tried to keep her voice normal. "What request?" Marcus looked her straight in the eye, not angry but authoritative. "I am ordering North Star Airlines to remove you from this flight immediately." The whole cabin was dead silent. Not a cough, not a heavy breath. Christine stood still. You can't do that," Marcus replied. "I don't make the decision alone, but I do have the right as a strategic partner in the passenger equity program to ask the captain to evaluate whether you are still fit to continue performing your duties." Captain Alan Fisher, who had just emerged from the cockpit after hearing the flight attendant's call, stopped in front of Marcus. "Mr. Hale, I have preliminary information." "What happened?" Marcus turned to him. Captain Fisher, I respect your profession, but I cannot allow my son or any other passenger to be on a flight led by someone who does not follow safety regulations. He pointed toward the back of the plane. She put a child in the emergency exit row. The captain blinked very quickly, but enough to show he understood the seriousness of the situation. Miss Ward said the captain, "Is that true?" Christine swallowed. I just thought it would be less troublesome to move the boy down below," annoying Marcus asked back. "Since when does a kid sitting in the right seat become annoying?" Christine was speechless. Captain Fisher stood still for a few seconds, then he said, "Mr. Hale, you asked Miss Ward to leave the flight. You have good reason. We cannot take off when there is a safety violation. I will immediately call ground support." Christine panicked. "Captain, I've worked at this firm for 18 years. You can't. You violated safety procedures," the captain said firmly. "And discrimination, if confirmed, is unacceptable." The other passengers looked at each other, then turned to Marcus. No one objected. A few even nodded in agreement. Jonathan now approached Christine. He said softly, "You should leave the plane. This is a necessary decision." Christine looked around. All eyes were on her. The silence was gone. No one was on her side. And in that moment she understood that just one wrong choice, just one judgment based on prejudice, could ruin a 20-year career. Christine turned away. Her voice was small. "I am sorry." But for Evan, the apology wasn't about him. It was about her own career. When the ground crew arrived and escorted Christine off the plane, no one in the cabin applauded. No one cheered. No one jeered. There was only silence. A silence worthy of the moment when a wrong must leave the space of the right. Marcus turned to Evan. "Are you okay?" he asked. Evan nodded slightly. "I don't want anyone to get fired," he said softly. "I just want to sit in my rightful place." That sentence touched the hearts of the whole cabin. Maria Lopez dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Richard Cole looked down, clenching his fists. Jonathan Reeves let out a breath very softly in recognition that this boy was stronger than anyone had thought. Marcus knelt down and placed his hands on Evan's shoulders. "I didn't lose anyone's job," he said. "I just stood up for what was right, and sometimes the truth costs people." Evan lowered his eyes. But this time, not because of sadness, but because he was trying to keep his emotions from spilling over. Marcus stood up. He spoke loudly and clearly. "Captain, I request that my son be returned to seat 1C. The captain nodded immediately. "Of course, Mr. Hale. We are very sorry for the incident." Jonathan held out his hand. "Evan, let me take you back to the right place." Evan stood up. He raised his head. He took slow steps, each one a way to reclaim the dignity others had tried to take away. As he walked through the first-class cabin, many passengers looked at him with respect, not pity. Evan sat down in 1C, fastened his belt, raised his head, not pride, but peace. Marcus looked at his son, then around the cabin as if he wanted to say something, and he was telling the truth. No one on this plane should have to see this. But since everyone did, I hope today's flight reminds us of one thing. Sometimes what's right doesn't come from rules. It comes from how we treat each other. Some in the cabin nodded. Some smiled. Some sighed softly, as if released from the silence they had allowed to drag on for too long. The captain walked over to Marcus. "We will give you a full report, sir." Marcus nodded slightly. "Thank you. I believe you." And that was the moment no one in first class will ever forget. The cabin began to close in on the chaos it had just experienced, like the surface of a rippling lake, slowly becoming calm. However, if you looked closely, you would see that just beneath the surface, the current was still as strong as ever. Marcus Hale stood next to Evan's seat, 1C, one hand resting lightly on the back of the seat, his eyes still observing everything in the cabin. Not because he suspected anyone, but because a father's heart, no matter how strong, could not relax immediately after witnessing his child being humiliated in front of so many people. Evan sat still, but his hands were clasped together, something no one noticed except Marcus. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly enough for Evan to hear, without attracting attention. Evan swallowed. "I think it's okay." Marcus leaned slightly, not forcing, not urging, just asked softly, "So what is heavy in your heart?" Evan looked out the window. The light from the runway reflected in his eyes, making them bright and sad. "I don't understand why they did that," he said. I wasn't causing trouble or taking anyone's seat. I was just sitting in the seat you gave me. Marcus nodded slightly. You're right. And how they treat you doesn't reflect who you are. It reflects who they are. Evan let out a small breath, a breath filled with enough loss that a child should never have to bear. In the rear cabin, Captain Alan Fisher was chatting quietly with the ground crew who were leaving the plane after disembarking Christine Ward. His face was thoughtful. Jonathan Reeves, who had just experienced a vivid career lesson, stood nearby. Jonathan, said the captain, you were the closest person to it. I need to know if you think what Mr. Hale says is true. Jonathan didn't need to think. Exactly, sir. The captain was silent for a moment. Have you ever seen Miss Ward do that to another passenger? Jonathan hesitated. A few times, nothing as serious as this. But she tends to be a little quick to judge certain types of passengers. The captain frowned. Surely. Jonathan lowered his voice. Blacks, Hispanics, young people, people who don't look like they fit into first class. The captain sighed. I should have seen this coming. Jonathan was confused. Captain, today, it made me realize sometimes my silence contributes to other people's mistakes. The captain looked at him, his eyes kind but stern. The important thing is that you see it now, and you're on the right side. Don't forget that. Jonathan nodded slightly. Thank you. Meanwhile, in first class, the atmosphere had calmed down. But it was not the same as the initial calm. This was a calm, deeper, heavier, but also more mature. Maria Lopez took a sip of water. She sat next to Evan and looked at Marcus for a long moment as if she wanted to say something but hesitated. Finally, she put her hand on Evan's chair and asked softly, Do you want to hear a story? Evan turned a little surprised. Yes. Maria smiled, not a polite smile, but the smile of a seasoned person who sees herself in a child. When I was your age, I took my first plane flight. I wore the most beautiful dress my mother had. But when I got into the cabin, a man just looked me up and down and said, You must be lost. I remember that feeling clearly to this day. Evan tilted his head. What did you do? Maria sighed softly. She left, without saying anything. But I wish I could do what you did today. Evan felt his heart lighten a little, not because his story was similar, but because he knew this feeling wasn't just his. Maria smiled. You're stronger than you think, and stronger than most adults I've ever met. Marcus heard the entire conversation. And in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt before. In 12 years of fatherhood, this child was becoming an adult in ways he hadn't expected. Just then, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the front of the cabin. 3 North Star Airlines employees entered: a site manager, a passenger safety supervisor, and an operations assistant. Marcus turned back. He didn't frown, didn't stand up, just asked gently, Shall we talk here or outside? The area manager, a man in his 40s named Samuel Price, bowed first. We are here to personally apologize to you and Evan on behalf of the company. Marcus remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Samuel looked around the cabin, inhaling as if preparing for the most difficult conversation of the day. We've heard from Captain Fisher, from Officer Reeves, and from several other passengers. What happened does not meet North Star Airlines standards. Marcus remained silent. Samuel continued. Your son was improperly moved. He was placed in an emergency exit row against safety standards. And most importantly, the decision was discriminatory. A sigh escaped from somewhere in the cabin. Marcus remained standing, his gaze so calm that even Samuel found it hard to breathe. Finally, Marcus asked, Are you saying that as a representative of the company or as an individual? Samuel hesitated. Both, sir. Marcus nodded. Okay. So, I want to know one thing after today. What are you planning to do to prevent this from happening to other kids without parents, who come in with special access cards? The plane cabin held its breath. Samuel clasped his hands. Mr. Hale, I will work with my team to review the entire minor admission process, ticket dispute resolution process, and flight attendant conduct review policy. Marcus looked deep into his eyes. And about discrimination, Samuel replied very slowly, We will open an internal investigation, and we will not show mercy to anyone. My commitment to you is this. North Star Airlines will not let silence become a shield for injustice. The statement made Richard Cole breathe a sigh of relief. Maria Lopez nodded, smiling at Evan. Marcus finally sat down next to his son. Evan looked at him as if to ask, Do you believe them? Marcus replied with a tired but confident smile. I believe that all real change always begins the moment a person is forced to face the truth. Samuel bowed again. When you are ready, we look forward to hearing your further proposals. The airline greatly respects your experience in the field of passenger equality. Marcus nodded. I'll talk after the flight. Samuel and 2 staff members left the cabin. In the cabin, no one said anything for a while. Then Evan turned to Marcus and asked softly, Dad, am I making things too complicated? Marcus looked at his son for a long time, then put his hand on his shoulder. Evan, he said slowly, each word like a stone set firmly on the ground. Justice never comes from easy times. Evan bowed his head, his eyes slightly red. Marcus squeezed his son's shoulder. You're not causing trouble. You're starting to change. And for the first time, Evan didn't look down. He looked straight ahead, as if the lit runway wasn't just for planes, it was for his future. The jet engines outside began to hum softly as if the plane were rebreathing itself after an emotional storm. The first-class passengers had returned to their seats, but no one was completely relaxed. Not because of the flight delay, nor because of the complicated procedures, but because they have just witnessed something that few people want to admit. Prejudice can happen right in front of you, and if you stay silent, it becomes a part of you. Evan sat in seat 1C, back straight, hands resting neatly on his lap, but his chest was pounding uncontrollably. The boy had just learned a painful truth. Sometimes just being a black boy was seen differently no matter who he was, no matter how polite he was. Marcus watched his son from the side as if he could hear every thought going through his head. He didn't push, didn't press. He waited the way calm, steady fathers do. Evan took a deep breath and turned to Marcus. Dad. His voice was small, very small. Don't you think I should have kept quiet from the start? Just sat still, let them take me to the back of the plane, wait for takeoff, and then that's it. That question light, but piercing. Marcus didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed forward as if weighing each word. If you keep quiet, Marcus said slowly, it will be easier for everyone. Except you. Evan turned to look at his father. Do you know why? Marcus asked. Evan shook his head. Marcus put his hand to his heart. Because, here, he said softly, injustice creeps in when you don't stand up for what you know is right. Evan swallowed his throat, feeling a little tight. Easy has never been synonymous with right, Marcus continued. Evan sat still, looking down at his white sneakers, which he'd cleaned before the trip. He didn't cry. But Marcus knew sometimes children's hurt isn't in their tears. It's in how they try to hold them back. A slight movement made Evan look up. It was Richard Cole, the middle-aged white man in seat 1B, turning toward the father and son. His face held a rare confusion of the experienced. Marcus, he began, his voice low. You probably don't need to hear this, but I have to say it. Marcus looked over. Evan followed his gaze. Richard swallowed. I was sitting right here, right next to your son, and I saw him from the beginning, but I did nothing. He clasped his hands, his eyes falling to the floor as if examining himself. Not because I agree with Christine, not because I think the boy is wrong, but because, he hesitated, then said what few people have the courage to say, because I was worried about being seen as causing trouble. Marcus fell silent. Richard continued, but the truth is, my silence was also a part of why he had to step down to the back of the plane. I apologize, not because I was a bad person, but because I didn't dare to be a good person at the right time. Evan looked at him, blinking. Richard turned to the boy. Evan, I hope you don't think all adults are like that. You deserve better. And today, you reminded me of something I'd long forgotten. Doing the right thing is never easy. Evan took a deep breath, and for the first time since it happened, his eyes softened. He whispered, Thank you for telling the truth. Richard nodded vigorously. Really, I should be the one thanking you. In row 1D, Maria Lopez put her hand on her chest as if she had released something that had been weighing her down for a long time. She looked at Evan with warm eyes. Evan, you know, she said softly, children like you are the reason the world still has hope. Evan smiled, a very small smile. Preparing for takeoff, Captain Alan Fisher stepped out once more. No explanation, no justification, but to say what he felt needed to be said. Dear passengers, he began, his voice clear but humble, I would like to personally apologize to everyone for the recent incident. He looked at Evan. The captain's eyes changed, not with pity but with respect for a boy who had endured what few should endure in front of the entire cabin. "Evan," said the captain, "you acted with a composure that many adults lack. You deserved respect from the very beginning. Unfortunately, we did not give it to you." Evan bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, sir." The captain smiled kindly. "No, Evan. It's me thanking you." He turned to Marcus. "Mr. Hale, when the plane lands, I want to personally discuss with you the implementation of new procedures to avoid similar incidents. From today, our airline will be changing." Marcus nodded slightly. "I'm ready." When the captain returned to the cockpit, the first-class cabin fell into a very special silence, not heavy, but deep. It's as if everyone is looking at themselves, wondering what role they will play today. The silent one, the prejudiced one, the one who stands up, or the one who learns something. Evan leaned his head back. But inside him, another battle was starting. No one saw. Only Marcus, who was used to his son's gaze, knew what he was thinking. "What are you thinking, Evan?" he asked. Evan looked down at his hands. "Dad, if I were just a normal kid, not yours, no one would help me, right?" Marcus was silent for several seconds. The longest seconds he had ever experienced. Finally, he told the truth. "Maybe not." Evan swallowed. His voice was fragile. "So, is it true that only being someone is respected?" Marcus looked at his son as if trying to contain the pain he was feeling. He put his hand on Evan's shoulder. "Evan, respect isn't something you have to prove with your name or status. Respect is something you are entitled to simply because you are human," Evan sighed. "But they don't think so," Marcus replied. "Not everyone thinks so. But that's why the world needs people like you." Evan looked up. "Like me, yes. Strong but sympathetic, calm but unyielding, hurt but not hurting others." Evan was silent, his eyes filled with tears. Marcus patted his son on the shoulder. "Today you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for children like you who have been overlooked because of the color of their skin, because of their age, because of the silence of adults." After a long while, Evan said, "I still feel sad." "Sadness is true," Marcus replied. "Sadness is a sign that you have a heart." Evan nodded, then leaned his head against his father's shoulder. For the first time all day, he let out a truly light breath. Across the cabin, Maria pulled out her phone and jotted down a few lines. Richard looked out the window, his eyes looking back at himself from years ago. Jonathan Reeves, the youngest man there, was learning a lesson no aviation textbook could teach. In that silence, something bigger was happening. A black child just made the entire first-class cabin look at itself. The plane began to taxi down the runway. The cabin lights changed warmer, rounder, as if the sky were softening for Evan. But before accelerating, Marcus leaned toward his son. "You know," he said softly, "the hardest moments always come before you find your true strength." Evan turned. "And that moment is now." Marcus smiled. "No. It will come when you realize today you are not just the kid who was sent to the back of the plane, but the one who forced a system to stop and look in the mirror it had avoided for too long." Evan's eyes widened. The words hit him harder than anything else before. As the wheels accelerated, Evan whispered, "Dad, I want to do something after the flight." What Evan looked straight ahead, the gaze of a boy who had just taken a step beyond his years. "I want to write a letter to Miss Ward." Marcus was a little surprised. "You want to blame her?" Evan shook his head. "I wanted to tell her how I felt, not to punish her more, just to make her understand." Marcus looked at his son a long time, and for the first time that day he saw his son's eyes no longer obscured by the darkness of pain. "It's bright. Bright in a way that only people with inner strength can be." Marcus said softly, "Son, I'm proud of you," and the plane took off. As North Star Flight 782 climbed, the cabin was bathed in the quiet amber glow that night flights often bring. Below, a sea of white clouds stretched like a soft carpet. Above the sky was a deep, dark black. But in first class, Evan Hale's mind was restless. He looked out but saw no clouds. He saw no spectacular sight that other children often enjoyed. Evan just felt like he was being pushed to the back of the plane. That feeling followed like a shadow refusing to leave. Marcus glanced at his son. He knew when Evan was silent because he was watching, and when he was silent because he was deep. Marcus said softly, "You can tell me anything." Evan turned his face, tried to smile slightly, but failed. "I know," he said. Then silence. Marcus waited patiently. He didn't rush. He didn't force. The way he kept silent was the same way he taught his children since they were young to be silent so that they could find their own true words. After a long moment, Evan exhaled slowly. "Dad," he said, "I'm scared." Marcus didn't overreact. He simply asked, afraid of what Evan looked down at his hands resting on his lap, hands that had been clasped together nonstop. "I'm scared," he swallowed. "I'm scared that what happened today will happen again." Marcus leaned over. "Are you afraid they'll do the same to you again?" Evan shook his head. "Not just me. People who look like me. Black kids. Just because they don't look like everyone else in first class." Marcus took a deep breath. He had heard that from many adults. But hearing it from his 1-2-year-old son, it was different, Evan continued. "I tried to be strong today, but when they dragged me away, I felt so small. It was like there was an invisible wall telling me I don't belong here." His voice didn't shake, but his eyes did. Marcus put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Evan, it feels real. I won't deny it, but it's not the truth about you." Evan looked up at him, waiting for his next words, like someone waiting for a single light in a dark tunnel. "You are not small," Marcus continued. "You are bigger than that moment, and bigger than the narrow thoughts of those who cannot see you." Evan pursed his lips. "But Dad, what if I have to face it alone? You can't always be there for me." Marcus was silent. This was the question every father dreaded answering. He looked at his son, the child he had taught how to tie his shoes, how to fold his shirt, how to treat people kindly. But he never wanted to teach his children how to cope with the pain of discrimination. "I will never be completely alone," Marcus said, "because you taught me something no one can take away: dignity." Evan frowned. "Does dignity keep you from being dragged away?" Marcus smiled, a little sad but determined. "Not always, but it helps me stand up straight again." The boy was silent, thinking. Then Evan asked what he had been keeping in his heart all along. "Have you ever experienced something like me?" Marcus looked at his son, a question he always avoided, not because he was embarrassed, but because he knew it was heavy. But Evan was growing up, and the truth was the only thing that helped him understand where his strength came from. "Yes," Marcus said softly, almost a confession. "More than I thought." Evan was silent, waiting for him to continue. "When I was your age," Marcus said, "I was refused a seat on the school bus because I was sitting in the front row. The driver said, 'This isn't your seat,' even though it didn't say so." Evan narrowed his eyes. "What did you do?" "Refused to leave the chair. And then they called the warden. Dad was punished. No one defended him." Evan clenched his fists. "Is that fair?" "No," Marcus replied. "But I learned this: justice doesn't come to you. You have to walk toward it, even if others block your way." Evan was silent. The words sank into him as if they had always been in his heart. Just then, Maria Lopez leaned over gently. "Evan," she said in a voice as warm as a winter scarf, "do you know why we are all on your side?" Evan shook his head. "Because we saw that he didn't run away. He stood there holding his ticket and said something that adults sometimes don't dare say: 'This is my seat.'" Evan bowed his head. "But I was scared." Maria smiled. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Evan. Courage is being afraid, and still saying the right thing." He looked at her for a long time. For perhaps the first time, Evan felt like he had not only Marcus by his side, but also strangers learning to be better people because of him. From his seat as a steward, Jonathan Reeves looked over at Evan. The sight of the boy sitting silently, his back straight, reminded Jonathan of himself years earlier, a young man trying to be useful in a world that sometimes didn't welcome him. Jonathan stepped forward. "Evan," he said, "I want to apologize." Evan was surprised. "Uncle, why?" "Because I didn't speak up fast enough. I felt it was unfair, but I hesitated." Evan thought for a moment and asked, "Is it because you're afraid of trouble?" Jonathan chuckled, then nodded. "Yeah, right. But today you reminded me that sometimes grown-ups need someone to remind them to be right." Evan tilted his head. "So, I can remind you?" "Yes," Jonathan looked at him with sincere eyes, "and I will remember that for the rest of my career." Evan smiled, the first smile in hours. As Jonathan left, Marcus turned to his son. "See," he said, "today you didn't just face your fears, you made other people face theirs too." Evan was silent, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It's like when one is rebuilding a room in one's heart, gently placing each brick of dignity in its right place. The plane began to enter stable air, the cabin vibrating slightly like an invisible hand of the sky. Evan looked out the window. For the first time, he didn't see the heavy clouds. "Dad," he said, I want to do one more thing." Marcus asked, "What?" "I want to talk to my friends at school," Evan said slowly and clearly. "I want to tell them about today. Not so they will feel sorry for me, but so they will know that if they face injustice, they can stand up." Marcus looked at his son, and his eyes softened in a way only strong fathers do. "Evan, you have found your strength." Evan nodded slightly. "You're right. I don't want this fear to turn into anger. I want to turn it into something good." Marcus smiled slowly, deeply, the smile of a man seeing a seed he planted years ago, sprouting. "That," Marcus said, "is how strong people change the world." Evan leaned his head back in his chair. For the first time that day, he closed his eyes, not because he wanted to hide from the world, but because he was ready to open himself to it. The sky outside was dark, but inside the first-class cabin, it was much brighter. As North Star Flight 782 began descending toward Denver, the sky outside the window faded from deep blue to the pale orange of late afternoon. The light flooded into the first-class cabin, bathing Evan's face in a soft, golden hue, as if the heavens and earth were trying to comfort him after a day longer than any in his 12 years. Evan opened his eyes and looked out for the first time. Since the plane took off, he could actually see the beauty. "So beautiful," he whispered. Marcus looked at his son, his eyes softening. "Yes, beautiful. Do you feel lighter?" Evan nodded. I understand what you mean. You can't change what other people think, but you can stop them from deciding who you are." Marcus smiled. "That's a lesson adults learn over time." The plane touched down gently. But as soon as the wheels touched down, the first-class cabin became tense in a different way, no longer with fear or injustice, but with a sense of anticipation. Wait to see what the airline does next. Wait to see if Marcus Hale, the man who kept his cool through the storm, will be fully heard. The loudspeaker rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign turns off. Transfer passengers, please check your information." Captain Alan Fisher's voice was calm, but those in the cabin, especially those who had witnessed the story, knew clearly this was just the prelude to a bigger moment. When the seatbelt sign went off, Richard Cole turned to Evan. "You're the bravest kid I've ever met," he said. Evan bowed his head slightly. "I was just doing the right thing." Maria Lopez put her hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's enough to change a lot of things." Jonathan Reeves stepped forward from the middle of the cabin a little hesitantly. "Evan and Mr. Hale, we're meeting the airline's airport operations team outside the door. They want to speak to you directly." Marcus nodded. "I know." Jonathan looked at Evan and said sincerely, "You didn't just make the adults look back. You made the whole system stop." Evan's ears reddened slightly and he smiled, a small smile, a modest but warm one. The plane door opened. Fresh air rushed in, bringing with it airport noises, luggage carts, announcements, the footsteps of hundreds of people moving at once. But right outside the plane door, unlike the usual scene, there were about 7 people waiting. Among them was Samuel Price, the regional manager Marcus had met earlier. Next to him was Rebecca Sloan, North Star Airlines Director of Customer Service, someone who rarely went directly to the airport unless the situation was truly dire. Right between them, a small space was left, a space that seemed to be made just for Marcus and Evan to enter. Marcus took his son's shoulder lightly. "Come on, Evan." Evan took a deep breath, then stepped out, head straight, shoulders square, but there was still the worry in his eyes that any child has after being wronged. As soon as the father and son appeared, Rebecca Sloan stepped forward. A white woman in her 50s, she stood stocky, her eyes sharp but warm. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice both formal and sincere, "thank you for taking the time to meet with us." Marcus nodded. "I hope this isn't just a polite apology." Rebecca looked straight at him. "No, today we are here to make things right." Evan raised his eyebrows slightly, not in defiance but in surprise. Rebecca crouched down to the boy's level, an action many senior managers avoid as too improper. "Evan," she said softly, "you didn't deserve that. You were wronged, and it was our fault." Evan pursed his lips. He wasn't used to adults apologizing, so, matter-of-factly, Rebecca continued, "Tomorrow your airline will hold an emergency meeting to review its entire process for accepting minors, especially in first class." It will implement new rules to ensure that children like you are never seen as not belonging here again. Evan looked up. So, no one will be transferred just because they think I'm unfit. Rebecca put her hand to her heart. Never again. Maria Lopez stepped out of the plane and breathed a sigh of relief. Good. Finally, someone is willing to say it. Rebecca heard and turned. Thank you for speaking up on the plane. We took note. Maria nodded slightly. Samuel Price stepped forward, opened a small briefcase, and handed Marcus a document. Mr. Hale, this is an official invitation for you to join the Passenger Process Improvement Council, a group of independent experts assisting North Star in developing a new passenger equity policy. Your influence will help us move faster. Marcus did not immediately accept. He asked a question that many witnesses found important. Did you invite me because I am an expert, or because I am the father of this child? Both, Samuel replied without hesitation. But mainly because what Evan did forced us to reconsider everything. Marcus looked at Evan. Evan looked back, his eyes filled with worry and pride. Marcus received the documents. Suddenly, Rebecca called Evan softly. Evan, I want to ask you something. Yes, if there was one thing you would change about the way people at the company treat children, what would it be? Evan thought. Not long, but long enough for everyone to see he wasn't giving a casual answer. Finally, he said, I want you to see us as normal people, not as problems, not as mistakes, just normal people. A silence spread through the group of administrators. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of people whose humanity had been touched by something they had long since forgotten to look at. Rebecca let out a small breath. Thank you, Evan. It's a simple statement, but it might be the biggest thing we need to change. Marcus touched his son's shoulder lightly, saying nothing, but his eyes were full of pride. When all the formalities were over, the management team left. They didn't walk quickly. They walked like people carrying something important on their shoulders, a new responsibility. Evan and Marcus stood still, watching the bustling airport. But for them, the world seemed to slow down. Dad, Evan said softly, so. It's over. Marcus looked around then at his son. No, Evan, this is just the beginning. Evan tilted his head. Start what Marcus bent down to his son's level. He spoke slowly, each word laying the foundation. The beginning of you learning that your voice matters, that you can make the world stop and think, that you are not just the child who was wronged, but the person who makes it right. Evan exhaled. Not from exhaustion, but from relief. Then he took his father's hand. It was small, warm, and stronger than he expected. Dad, are we going to eat something? Marcus chuckled. After all the turmoil, the question brought him an unexpected sense of peace. Yes. What do you want to eat? Evan thought for a moment and said, What do you want to eat that reminds you that today isn't all bad? Marcus smiled. So let's go find the best thing to eat at this airport. The father and son walked. Not in a hurry. Not heavily. Just a father and a child, just going through the first day where they both realized justice sometimes comes slowly, but when it does, it opens a door bigger than the pain. The Denver airport food court was ablaze with lights as Marcus and Evan walked in. Neon signs, the smell of baking cookies and roasting coffee mixed together to create an atmosphere both hurried and cozy, a world away from the stressful moments that had just passed. Evan chose a small burger joint at the end of the row, somewhere not too crowded, not too noisy. He didn't speak, but Marcus understood Evan needed some quiet, no looks, no questions. The father and son sat at a table by the window overlooking the runway. Evan put the tray of food down on the table, then silently picked up the burger, but didn't bite into it right away. Marcus looked at his son. Slowly. What are you thinking about, Evan? Turned the burger over in his hand. I don't know. I felt better when I met the managers outside. But now that I think about it, I suddenly feel sick. Marcus nodded slightly. Because I can finally relax. Evan looked up. Relax. Yes. When you keep calm for too long, when it's safe, your body will tell you how tired it is. Evan put down his burger and leaned back in his chair. Dad, did I do the right thing? I did what a decent adult would do, Marcus replied. Not running away, not being rude, not staying silent when wronged. That was right. Evan took a deep breath as if allowing himself to believe those words. But just seconds later, something caused the atmosphere to change slightly. A group of 3 people at the opposite table began whispering, then turned to look at the father and son. just briefly at first. But then one of them pulled out his phone, opened the screen, scrolled, and then looked at Evan intently. Evan saw. He stopped. Marcus followed his son's gaze and understood immediately what was happening, not because they recognized him, but because the story had started to spread. The woman in the group stepped forward, a little embarrassed, but determined. "Excuse me, can I ask a question?" Marcus nodded, remaining polite. "Please." She pulled out her phone. On the screen was a post that was being shared at a dizzying speed. A short video, shot from a first-class seat. Evan's face is not visible, but Christine is clear as she stops him, and Evan's voice is clear, calmly saying, "This is my seat, ma'am. I'm just telling the truth." Headline: 2-year-old boy kicked out of first-class seat for not looking like a ticket holder. Here's his reaction. Over 50,000 shares, 12,000 comments. The hashtag started appearing, "Dignity in the skies, let kids belong, equal wings." Evan's eyes widened. "What is that?" the woman whispered. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say, your son is admirable. He's calmer and stronger than many adults I've ever met." Evan bowed his head, his ears red as if trying to hide from this very attention. Marcus smiled politely. "Thank you for saying that." The woman nodded, then returned to her table. Evan looked at his cold burger. "Dad, I don't want to be famous," Marcus chuckled. "Trust me, fame was never my plan. But sometimes people share their true stories because they find themselves in them," Evan thought. "But I just want to stay in my chair." "Yes," Marcus said softly, "and it's because I just wanted that simple thing that people found the story touching." About 10 minutes later, a black man in his 30 approached their table. He was wearing a sports jacket and carrying a suitcase. "Sorry, Marcus," he said a little nervously. "I saw you in the video, and thank you for standing up for your son. I have an 8-year-old son, and I worry. I worry about him growing up in a world like this." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What's your name?" "I'm Aaron." Marcus shook his hand. "Thank you, Aaron. And believe me, no child should grow up worrying that they don't belong where they have a right to be." Aaron looked at Evan. "You give me hope." Evan blushed and nodded politely. Aaron left. Evan sat still, seemingly digesting things that had gone beyond his imagination just a few hours ago. "Dad?" Evan asked. "Why does everyone care?" "It only happened to me." Marcus put his hands on the table and looked at his son for a long time. "Evan, you don't just represent you. You represent everyone who has ever been overlooked, judged because of their appearance, because of prejudice, because of things they can't change." Evan swallowed. "I don't want to represent anyone." Marcus smiled sadly. "No one wants to. But sometimes, circumstances choose you before you choose them." Marcus's phone vibrated. A message from Samuel Price. "The video is going viral. The board wants to meet with you and Evan in the next 48 hours to discuss the new process." Evan saw his dad looking at his phone. "What news, Dad?" "Good news," Marcus replied. Today's story was not only heard, but also given due attention. Evan leaned back in his chair. "I was afraid. They would think I was overreacting." Marcus shook his head. "I did nothing wrong. When people's wrongdoings are exposed, there's always someone who says I'm exaggerating, because they're afraid to look at the truth." Evan looked at his hands. "So, what should I do next?" Marcus said softly. "You don't have to do anything. You just need to continue living with your dignity. The rest I and the people in charge will handle." Evan let out a sigh, long but soft. However, at that moment, a sound rang out that caught the attention of both father and son. "Excuse me, are you Evan Hale?" Evan turned. A girl of about 11, brown skin, long curly hair, stood before them. Beside her was her mother, her eyes full of warmth. The little girl smiled shyly. "I saw your video. Thank you for standing up. Because I was told I don't look like someone who goes to expensive summer camp. It made me sad." Evan looked at her for a few seconds. He saw himself in the story that had just happened. He spoke softly but clearly. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just be yourself." The little girl smiled wider. "Thank you." Marcus watched silently as the two children exchanged the empathy that adults take years to learn. As she left, Evan turned to his father. "Dad, I think I understand." "Understand what?" "That what happened today wasn't just about me." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, And that's why your voice matters. Evan took a sip of water, then smiled, a small smile, a real smile, not forced. Dad, I think I'm ready for the meeting with the company. Marcus looked a little surprised. Are you sure? There will be a lot of people, a lot of questions, a lot of pressure. Evan took a deep breath. I know. But if I don't tell, who will tell the kids like me? Marcus looks at his son as if he were a miniature adult, not because Evan was forced to grow up too soon, but because he chose the most beautiful way to grow up. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. Son, I always believed in you. But now, I've learned from you too. Evan laughed. So it's a tie, Dad, Marcus chuckled. Yeah, it's a tie. Outside the glass doors, dusk gradually gave way to darkness, but inside the airport, the lights were still bright. Evan looked at the planes taxiing on the runway, then said softly as if talking to himself, You may not always belong somewhere right away, but that doesn't mean you're not worthy. Marcus looked at his son, silent, but inside he felt a warm, hopeful current flowing through him. The next morning, the Northwing Airlines headquarters in Chicago was bathed in a soft morning light. Sky-high windows reflected the blue sky behind them. It seemed like a peaceful scene, but inside was a meeting unlike any other in the airline's history. Marcus Hale entered the building with his usual calm demeanor. He had no entourage, no lawyers, no press team. Evan was by his side, a small backpack slung over one shoulder, his hand lightly gripping the strap, taking short, steady steps. They had not spoken a word all the way from the hotel to here, but the silence was not heavy. It was like the pause before an orchestra plays its opening note. Samuel Price was waiting in front of the large conference room. His eyes lit up when he saw Evan. Hello, father and son, Samuel bowed slightly. Today, may be a little long and crowded, but I just want you to know everyone in this room has seen the video, and everyone wants to hear from Evan. Evan paused. Hearing them want to hear me, it's a little strange. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. Weird, but worth it. Samuel smiled. Are you two ready? Evan took a breath, very deep, very slow. Yes, I'm ready. The door opened. A long room filled with nearly 30 people, from executives, department heads, legal representatives, media to the airport operations team. They all stood up when Marcus and Evan walked in. No noise, no fanfare, just respect. Northwing Airlines General Manager Caroline Brooks, a middle-aged woman with youthful silver hair, stepped forward and held out her hand. Mr. Hale, I'm sorry, that's the first thing I want to say. But I know sorry isn't enough. Marcus shook her hand. We didn't come here to fight, we came here to fix. Caroline turned to Evan, crouching down to get a good look at him. Evan, thank you for coming. We know this isn't easy, Evan replied in a small but clear voice. I think there are things that are not easy but still need to be said. The room fell silent for a moment. Caroline smiled gently. Say what you want to say today. Everyone here will listen. The meeting begins. First, the operations team presented the old process. Slides lit up the room. Thick lines of text. Processes that seemed complete, but Marcus realized the most important things were in the spaces between the lines. And he knew Evan realized it too. Dad, Evan whispered, I don't see anywhere that says to consider the situation before judging. Marcus nodded. Yes, and that's what I needed to say. When it was Evan's turn, the room fell silent. He stood up and walked up to the screen. No paper, no notes, just the truth. I'm not angry, but I remember things, Evan began. I remember the way people looked at me. I remember how they made up their minds before asking me any questions. I remember trying to explain, but no one wanted to listen. Some people bowed their heads. But what I remember most clearly, Evan continued, is that there were so many kids like me out there. Kids who knew they were right, but had no one to stand by them. He took a deep breath. His voice shook a little, but didn't break. I don't want anyone to have to call my dad, just to sit in the same chair they paid for. One of the operators raised his hand to his face as if wiping away a tear. And I don't want adults to think I'm causing trouble. I just don't want to be seen as wrong just because I look different. The room was deathly silent. Samuel Price nodded proudly. Caroline Brooks put her hand to her heart, touched. Marcus looked at his son, and for the first time that morning he let out a long breath. Evan finished speaking, bowed his head a little, then walked over and sat next to Marcus. His hand was shaking slightly, but Marcus took it and held it tight. You did good, Marcus whispered. Evan smiled, soft and deep. Caroline stood up. Evan, thank you, she said. And this is what we decided, not because you spoke well, but because you spoke the truth, she signaled to Samuel. Samuel turned on the new slide. Title The Even Initiative, a new standard of respect. Caroline looked around the room. Her voice was firm, strong, but full of emotion. Starting today, Northwing Airlines will implement a new code of conduct for all ground staff and flight attendants. A code based on 3 values: see, listen, understand. She held up 3 fingers. No one should judge a passenger before looking at the facts. No one should make a decision before hearing from the passenger. No one should implement a procedure without understanding its impact on people. The room was silent, and Caroline continued. We invite Evan and Mr. Marcus to be honorary advisors for the training program for the next year. Evan's eyes widened. Me, Caroline smiled. Because no one knows better than someone who has been affected. Marcus squeezed his son's shoulder, unable to hide his pride. After the decision part comes the open discussion part. A veteran flight attendant stood up. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. I've been doing this for 17 years, and I used to think I was fair. But listening to you, I realize I can be too quick to judge sometimes. Thanks for waking me up. Another ground staff member said, Evan, you remind me of my son. I want him to grow up in a more just world. And you are one step closer to that. Evan nodded awkwardly. I just said what I felt. The man replied, and sometimes, that's what adults need to hear most. At the end of the meeting, Caroline came to shake hands with father and son. We will be sending out the official paperwork in the next few days, she said. But today is a historic day for North Wing. Marcus politely replied, thank you for listening. Caroline turned to Evan, and thank you for reminding us adults of the most important thing: kindness is never a small thing. The two of them left the building as the sun was high in the sky. Evan paused on the steps. He looked up at the sky, where planes cut through the deep blue. Dad. Evan said, I think, now I understand why you always say silence is an option, but it's not always the right choice. Marcus smiled. And today you chose the right thing. Dad, Evan asked, will this really change anything? Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at his son, his eyes held innocence, but also a strength that not all adults possessed. No one changes the world, Marcus said, but you change a part of it. A real part, a part that is seen. And when that part changes, the other parts gradually change. Evan smiled. It was a small but deep smile, as if he had just laid down some invisible burden he had been carrying for the past 24 hours. I just want to sit in my right seat, Evan said softly. Marcus patted his son's head. And you've helped thousands of other children do that. As they turned to leave, Marcus realized something quietly but clearly. Sometimes the biggest changes in society start with a small word from a child who knows how to keep his dignity. And that was the moment Marcus understood. Yesterday's flight didn't make a hero. It just made a boy realize he was already strong. Evan turned to his dad, his eyes lighting up. Dad, do we want to go get pancakes? Marcus laughed. Of course. Little heroes need a proper breakfast too. The two of them walked on quietly, gently, as if everything that had just happened was just a small chapter in their long journey. But behind them, the glass doors of the North Wing reflected 2 figures, one large, one small, stepping into the future with new confidence. A future that Evan helped usher in. Thank you for following the story. If this story touches you, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, to continue accompanying other emotional journeys. Because sometimes a small story is enough to change something in each of us.